The twin suns of Varan Prime hung low in the orange sky, casting long shadows over the city's outer district. Here, the air was thick with smoke and dust, and the streets were filled with the noise of shouting merchants and clanging metal. The market was a maze of stalls and cages where everything could be bought, from rare minerals to strange alien creatures. But deeper inside the market, far from the bright lights, was a place where the trade was darker. It was here that Liara had spent more days than she could count. She sat in a corner of her cage, knees drawn close, her thin arms wrapped around herself. The metal collar around her neck was connected to a chain that rattled whenever she moved. Her skin, pale blue under the dim lights, had lost its natural shine from months of dirt and neglect. Her eyes were a soft silver, but the spark in them had faded long ago. She had learned that in this place, hope was dangerous. Hope could be taken away. Around her, other beings in cages sat in silence or whispered quietly. The smell of oil, sweat, and stale air filled the space. Merchants shouted to passing buyers, boasting about strength, skill, or obedience. Every life here had a price, and every price was negotiable. The merchant who owned Liara was a tall, insect-like creature named Vorth. His voice was sharp and unpleasant, and he had no patience for hesitation. When buyers came near, he would yank Liara's chain to pull her forward, making her stand and look presentable. He would list her qualities in a loud, rehearsed voice, but Liara stopped listening long ago. She knew the words were lies or half-truths. On this day, the market was busier than usual. Ships from distant systems had arrived, bringing traders, mercenaries, and travelers. The noise was overwhelming, and Liara sat still, waiting for the hours to pass. She had no reason to think today would be different from any other day. Then she saw him. He wasn't like the other buyers. He was human. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered brown coat and boots that looked made for long travel. His hair was dark, streaked slightly with gray, and his eyes were steady and sharp. He walked with a calm, unhurried step, scanning the market without rushing toward any stall. When he entered the shaded section where Liara's cage was, the crowd seemed to shift around him. Captain Elias Kane didn't come to this part of the market often. He disliked what it stood for, but his latest job required parts he could only find here. As he walked, his gaze fell on the row of cages. He wasn't looking for anyone, but when his eyes landed on Liara, he stopped. She noticed the pause and looked away quickly, assuming it was just another buyer measuring her value. But Kane didn't look at her the way the others did. There was no calculation in his eyes, no cold interest. Instead, there was something harder to define, a mixture of curiosity and quiet anger, as though he disliked what he saw but refused to turn away. Vorth saw Kane's attention and moved quickly. "Fine specimen," the merchant hissed in his insect-like voice. "Strong, obedient, will work without complaint." Kane's eyes stayed on Liara. "How long has she been here?" Vorth waved one claw dismissively. "Long enough to know her place. You won't find better for the price." Kane's voice was calm but carried weight. "Name the price." Vorth hesitated. Most buyers spent time bargaining, testing, asking questions. This human's directness was unusual. He named a number, high, expecting negotiation. Kane didn't argue. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thin chip of credits, and handed it over. Liara stared. No one had ever paid without haggling. It didn't make sense. Buyers always wanted a bargain, and lives here were just another trade item. She expected some trick, some reason he would change his mind. But Kane simply said, "Open the cage." Vorth looked pleased at the quick sale, though suspicious at Kane's lack of resistance. Still, credits were credits. He unlocked the cage and unhooked the chain from the wall. Liara stood slowly, uncertain if she should move. Kane stepped forward, taking the chain gently from Vorth's hand. "Let's go," he said to her, his tone neither harsh nor overly kind, just steady. She followed him out of the shaded market into the brighter streets, blinking at the sudden light. The chain between them felt loose, almost unnecessary, but she didn't know what to make of it. She kept a few steps behind, watching the way he walked, confident but not pulling her along. No one had ever led her without force before. As they passed through the crowded streets, Liara kept her eyes on the ground, expecting stares or jeers from others. A few did glance at her, but Kane's presence seemed to make them keep their distance. There was something about him that suggested trouble for anyone who tried to interfere. They reached the docking bay, where rows of ships waited like sleeping beasts. Kane led her toward a medium-sized freighter with a hull marked by old repairs and travel stains. Its name was painted near the side, the Horizon's Light. When they stopped at the ramp, Kane unclipped the chain from her collar. She looked at him in confusion, touching her neck where the metal had rested for so long. "You won't need that," he said simply. "Not here." She didn't know what to say. She hadn't been without a chain or collar in years. Part of her wanted to ask why, but the words wouldn't come. She followed him up the ramp into the ship. Inside, the air smelled faintly of metal and clean machinery, nothing like the stale, dirty cages. The corridors were narrow but well kept. Kane walked ahead, showing her to a small cabin with a bed, a folded blanket, and a small storage locker. It was simple, but to her it looked impossibly comfortable. "This will be your room," Kane said. "There's food in the mess hall when you're ready." She stood in the doorway, unsure if she should step inside. Kane didn't push her. He simply nodded and left her there, walking toward the cockpit. For a long time, Liara didn't move. She stared at the bed, at the closed door, at the space that was hers, or at least seemed to be. The ship's hum was steady, almost comforting. She finally sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the fabric. It was soft, warmer than she expected. She didn't understand the human's reasons. She didn't believe in sudden kindness. But as she sat in the quiet cabin, the noise of the market far behind her, a small part of her, a part she thought was gone, began to wonder if this might be the start of something different. The Horizon's Light hummed quietly as it lifted away from Varan Prime. The heavy atmosphere of the planet faded into the endless black of space, and the twin suns became small, glowing points far behind them. Liara sat in her cabin, staring at the metal floor. She could feel the vibration of the engines beneath her feet. It had been hours since the human Captain Elias Kane brought her aboard. He hadn't come back to speak to her, nor had he locked her in. The door to her cabin wasn't even shut all the way, just closed enough to give her privacy. She had no chain, no collar, no orders. It felt strange, and strange was dangerous. In her experience, kindness always had a cost. People in the market sometimes pretended to be gentle to earn trust, only to use it later. She didn't know this man's game yet, but she was sure he had one. The smell of food drifted down the corridor, warm and inviting. Her empty stomach twisted painfully. She ignored it at first, but the hunger grew too strong. Slowly, she rose from the bed and stepped into the hallway. The ship was quiet, only the steady hum of the engines and the soft beep of controls somewhere ahead. She followed the scent until she found the mess hall, a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a food dispenser along the wall. Kane was sitting there, a steaming mug in his hand. He looked up when she entered. "Hungry?" Liara froze in the doorway, unsure if she was even allowed inside. Kane gestured toward the dispenser. "Go ahead, food's fresh." She hesitated. I don't know how to use it." Kane stood, walked to the dispenser, and pressed a few buttons. A tray slid out, holding a bowl of hot stew and a piece of bread. He set it on the table and stepped back. "There, Eat while it's warm. She sat slowly, her movements cautious, like she expected him to pull the tray away. When he didn't, she picked up the spoon and tasted the stew. It was simple, vegetables and grain, but the flavor felt like a feast compared to the tasteless ration paste she had been given in the market. Kane didn't watch her closely. He sipped his drink and looked at the star field outside the small window. After a while, he said, "I'm heading to the trade station at Orvis Gate. I'll drop off cargo there." She kept her eyes on the bowl. "And then? Then I'll see what's next," he said. "You can stay on board until you decide what you want to do." Her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Decide? The word felt strange. Decisions weren't for her to make. In the market, she had no choices, only orders. Kane nodded. "You're not my property, Liara. You're free now." She stared at him, trying to see if he was mocking her. Free? No one had ever said that to her. Freedom was a word from stories. She had long stopped believing. "Why?" she asked at last. He didn't answer immediately. He set his mug down, his gaze steady. "Because I don't believe anyone should live in chains, and because I could see you didn't belong in that place." Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she did belong there because the world had made it so, but the words stayed inside. When she finished eating, she stood to take the tray to the dispenser, but Kane shook his head. "Leave it. I'll handle it." She returned to her cabin, but her thoughts were restless. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the ship. Kane's words replayed in her mind. "You're not my property." Hours passed. She heard the soft clang of tools in the distance and the faint sound of music from the cockpit. Her curiosity grew. Finally, she stepped out and followed the sound. Kane was in the maintenance bay, crouched beside an open panel in the wall. Wires and parts were spread on the floor. A small music player rested nearby, playing a calm melody. He glanced up when she entered. "Could use a hand if you're up for it." She hesitated. "I don't know how to fix things." "I'll show you," he said simply, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. She knelt beside him, and he handed her a small tool. His instructions were clear and patient. "Hold this wire, tighten that bolt, connect this panel." She expected him to snap at her if she made a mistake, but he never did. When she got something wrong, he just showed her the right way. They worked in silence for a while, and though the silence wasn't warm, it wasn't heavy either. For the first time in years, she felt useful, not as a tool, but as someone helping with a task. When they finished, Kane closed the panel and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Good work." Liara almost didn't know how to respond. Praise was not something she understood. She gave a small nod and stepped back. As she left the bay, she found herself thinking about his manner, calm, steady, and without cruelty. He didn't treat her like something he owned. That was dangerous. Dangerous because it made her want to believe it was real. Later that night, lying in her cabin, she couldn't sleep. She thought about the market, about the cold eyes of the buyers, and about the way Kane had simply handed over credits without question. She didn't understand his reasons, but she couldn't deny one thing. This ship was nothing like the cages. For the first time in a long time, she didn't dread what the next day might bring, and that frightened her more than anything. The Horizon's light sailed through deep space, its engines a steady hum that filled every corner of the ship. Outside the windows, stars drifted past in slow motion, some bright and sharp, others faint like dust in the dark. Liara had been aboard for 3 days now. Each day was quiet, no shouting, no orders, no threats. Kane gave her space, speaking only when necessary. He didn't ask her questions she wasn't ready to answer. It was as if he understood she needed time to breathe without fear. Still, the quiet felt strange. In the market, noise had been constant. Clanging chains, merchants yelling, captives, whispering. Here, silence pressed in from every side, and Liara didn't know if she liked it. She spent most of her time in her cabin, unsure if she was allowed to wander. The door was never locked, but old habits told her to stay put unless called. Once, she tried stepping out, but when she heard Kane's footsteps nearby, she quickly went back in. That morning, she sat on the bed running her fingers along the blanket. It was warm and soft, something she still couldn't get used to. Hunger eventually pushed her to leave the cabin. She walked quietly toward the mess hall, moving like a shadow in case she was somewhere she shouldn't be. Kane was already there, sitting with a data tablet in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. He looked up as she entered. "Morning." She paused. No one had greeted her like that in years. She gave a small nod and went to the food dispenser. She still didn't know all the buttons, but she had watched him enough to remember the stew setting. Kane didn't comment on her movements, but she noticed he was watching her without staring. His eyes held a steady calmness, like he wasn't expecting anything from her. She took her tray and sat on the far end of the table. "Sleep well?" he asked. She hesitated. Yes. It wasn't true. She had woken up several times during the night, but it felt easier to say yes than explain. After a few moments, he returned his attention to the tablet, scrolling through trade logs. The silence between them was not heavy. It was comfortable in a way. When she finished eating, she stood to leave. Kane spoke before she reached the door. "If you want to walk around the ship, you can. You're not a prisoner here." She turned slightly. "I don't know where I'm allowed to go." He set the tablet down. "Anywhere except the engine core when I'm not there. Everything else is open. You'll get used to it." She didn't answer, but the idea sat in her mind. Anywhere. She couldn't remember the last time she had permission to simply walk. Later, she decided to try. The corridors of the Horizon's light were narrow but clean, lit with soft white panels in the ceiling. She passed the cockpit, where Kane sat in the pilot's chair scanning readings, and kept walking until she found a wide observation room at the front of the ship. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of systems. A curved window stretched across the wall, showing the endless field of stars. Liara stepped closer, her breath catching. From the cages, she had seen the sky only through cracks or dirty glass. Here the stars looked endless and alive. She sat in one of the small seats near the window and stayed there for a long time. She didn't even notice Kane appear in the doorway until he spoke. "Beautiful, isn't it?" She turned slightly, but didn't answer. He came closer, standing a few steps behind her. "When I was young, I thought space was just empty. But the more I traveled, the more I saw there's something alive out here, even if we can't see it." She looked back at the stars. "I used to think it was just a story." "It's real," Kane said. "And now, it's yours to see too." She didn't know what to say to that. Part of her wanted to believe him. Part of her feared that if she believed, it would be taken away. The next day, Kane was working in the cargo bay. When he called her over, "I could use an extra hand." She approached cautiously. He pointed to a crate. "We're moving these into storage. Careful, they're heavier than they look." They worked together, lifting and stacking. Kane didn't rush her. When she struggled, he adjusted the grip with her, never scolding or raising his voice. By the time they finished, her arms ached, but there was a strange satisfaction in the effort. "Good work," Kane said. "You learn quick." She didn't respond, but inside something shifted. It wasn't the same as doing forced labor in the market. Here, the work felt shared. That night, she returned to the observation room. The stars were there again, constant and quiet. She thought about the days she had spent on this ship. Kane hadn't touched the chain since removing it. He hadn't locked her in. He hadn't tried to buy her loyalty. She still didn't understand why. But for the first time, she caught herself wondering what it would be like to believe his words. That she was free now, and that this ship could be her home. It was a dangerous thought. But as she sat by the window, the stars reflecting in her silver eyes, she didn't push it away. The horizon's light cruised silently through the quiet stretches of space near the asteroid belt of the Velkar system. The stars glittered faintly, but an uneasy tension filled the ship's narrow corridors. Captain Kane had been watching the navigation screens carefully for hours. A storm of small meteoroids was moving through their path, fast and unpredictable. Liara sensed the change. The steady hum of the ship seemed sharper, almost tense. She stood near the cockpit door, watching Kane work with calm focus. But she could see the tightness in his jaw. "We might get hit," Kane said without looking up. "If a big enough rock strikes the hull, it could cause serious damage." Liara's heart raced. The word damage sounded dangerous. She felt the old fear rise. But Kane's calm voice kept it from overwhelming her. "Is there something I can do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kane turned, studying her. For the first time, he spoke to her as a partner, not a passenger. "Yes, come with me." He led her down a narrow corridor to the maintenance bay. Panels and tools lined the walls. The bay was filled with equipment used to repair the ship's systems in case of emergency. Kane opened a large metal cabinet and pulled out several heavy tools and repair patches. "During a storm like this, damage to the hull is common," Kane explained. "We need to be ready to fix it fast." He handed her a set of gloves and a repair patch. "If a breach opens, you'll help me patch it until I can seal it properly." Liara took the tools, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't sure if she could do it, but she didn't want to disappoint Kane. The storm hit sooner than expected. The ship's alarms blared loudly, flashing red lights all over the corridors. The walls shook as meteoroids struck the hull with harsh impacts. Kane grabbed his helmet and moved quickly. "To the maintenance bay! Now!" Liara followed closely behind, clutching the repair patch tightly. The ship's vibration made her stomach churn, but she kept her feet steady. When they reached the bay, Kane opened the external maintenance hatch. Outside, dark space flashed with streaks of meteor fire. A small hole had opened in the hull, and air hissed out. "Hold the patch here," Kane ordered, pointing to the breach. Liara pressed the patch against the hole with both hands. The cold metal surface was harsh against her gloves, but she didn't move. The air whooshed past the edges, cold and sharp. Kane worked beside her, securing the patch with clamps and fasteners. His movements were quick but careful. "Steady," he said. "You're doing fine." The patch held, and the hiss of escaping air slowed. Kane activated the internal seal system to reinforce the repair. After a tense moment, the alarm stopped, and the ship's hum returned to normal. The emergency. Lights faded, and the red glow softened to the usual blue. Liara pulled the gloves off, her hands sweaty despite the cold. She looked at Kane, waiting for his reaction. He smiled. A rare, genuine smile. "Good work, Liara. You stayed calm and did exactly what was needed." For the first time, she felt something warm inside her chest. Pride. Not the forced pride from the market's harsh words, but a quiet, honest pride. Later, Kane invited her to the cockpit. He showed her the navigation systems, explaining how he tracked the storm and predicted danger. "You're learning fast," he said. "You have more strength and courage than you know." Liara listened, absorbing every word. It was strange to hear such praise without a hidden meaning. Kane wasn't using her strength as a tool. He was admiring it. That night, as the ship sailed peacefully through space, Liara sat by the viewport again. The stars were calm, but her thoughts were alive. She thought about Kane's words, about the trust he showed her during the storm. For the first time, she wanted to believe that someone cared, not just as an owner, but as a friend. The horizon's light slowed as it approached the bustling spaceport of Varan Prime. The bright lights of the station glowed against the darkness of space like a city of stars. Captain Kane stood at the cockpit controls, watching the docking, protocols with quiet concentration. Liara stood behind him, her heart pounding. The memories of the market, chains, cages, and cruel voices rose sharply in her mind. This was the place where her nightmare began, the place she had run from but never truly escaped. "You don't have to go," Kane said softly, noticing her tension. "We can stay in space a little longer if you want." She shook her head. "No, I need to face it." The ship docked smoothly and the airlock hissed open. Kane led her through the station, past busy traders, noisy merchants, and curious eyes. Whispers followed them, a human and the pale, silver-eyed alien girl known in the market. Word spread quickly. The merchant who once owned Liara, Vorth, had heard about her escape and Kane's purchase. He was furious. His anger echoed through the station like thunder. Kane didn't hide their presence. Instead, he went straight to the station's security office. The officials were surprised to see him, and even more surprised when he demanded to speak about illegal trading activities on Varan Prime. Liara stood silently beside him, her hands clenched. She felt a mix of fear and hope. This was her chance to break free, not just from chains, but from the shame and silence that had held her for so long. The merchant Vorth stormed into the security office, shouting that Liara was stolen property and must be returned immediately. The guards listened but were cautious. Kane calmly presented his proof, the credits paid, and the records of illegal captivity. Then Kane did something unexpected. He stepped back and let Liara speak. Her voice was soft at first, trembling like a leaf in the wind. But as she told her story, her words grew stronger, clearer. She spoke of the cages, the chains, the cold nights, and the cruel merchants who treated her like dirt. The room fell silent. The officials exchanged looks. Her story was true, and it was a crime. When she finished, Kane placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "No one should be treated like that." The station's authorities arrested Vorth and promised to investigate the illegal trade network. Liara felt tears she hadn't cried in years. The weight of her past began to lift. Kane looked at her and smiled warmly. "You're free, not just from chains, but from fear." For the first time, Liara believed it.